After college graduation, my best friend Sarah and I celebrated by going on a trip to London, a very thrifty trip to London as college graduates. We lived on cheese sandwiches and hostel breakfasts, not hostile as in violent, hostile, you get what I mean. And it was my first time using a subway system, which was the London Tube. And it's famous for this message that you see all over the London Tube: mind the gap. It's on the floor, it's on the speakers, it's everywhere. Mind the gap. And getting on the first train the first time, I didn't understand the message because it was a pretty seamless transition, like a person actually went through on a wheelchair as I was watching. So I didn't understand why are we making such a big deal about this gap? Are these Londoners like a little bit slow or something? I didn't catch on until we were at the next station waiting for our train, seeing somebody trip on what was a large gap between the platform and the train. Not only was there a gap of space, but there was also a height differential. What I learned about the London Tube system is that it's kind of piecemealed together. And so the curves in the stations are not always the same, and the heights of the trains are not always the same. So the gap might be really different on one train versus another. Minding the gap matters. You'll get on the train either way, unless the gap is really big and you fall into it. But there's a huge difference there between having a smooth and pleasant ride and falling on your face in front of hundreds of people or worse. Mind the gap. And the same is true for how we step from the current moment into the future. Now, the future is always unfolding in front of us. It's always unfolding, and sometimes it might seem like the future is unfolding in ways that we have no control over. But hear the good news, my friends. There is a gap between what's now and what's next. And minding that gap makes all the difference. So in a couple of weeks, we're going to be engaging together as a congregation in a strategic planning exercise. It sounds super boring, but I promise you it will be interesting and hopefully even a little bit fun. We've been in the process as consistory of asking God to show us what's emerging among us, and then pondering how we can get organized and mobilized to pursue God's emerging future faithfully. We are trying to be mindful about the gap of where we are between where we are now as a congregation and where God would like to take us in the future. So for these next couple of weeks, we're going to be spending a little bit of time around minding that gap between what's now and what's next, because it matters so much for us and for the world. The prophet Isaiah speaks about minding the gap in Isaiah chapter 43, verses 18 and 19. He says this: "Do not remember the former things or consider the things of old. I'm about to do a new thing. Now it springs forth. Do you not perceive it? I will make a way in the wilderness and rivers in the desert." The prophet Isaiah speaks about minding that gap between what's now and what's next. And today we're going to zoom in to super specific and deeply personal minding of the gap between stimulus and response. The gap between stimulus and response. I think you know what I mean. Stimulus is something that happens, and response is what we do about that thing. Stimulus, response. Viktor Frankl, and then next week we'll zoom out to a bigger picture of the gap. Viktor Frankl says it's something like this: between stimulus and response, there is a space, a gap. And in that space is our power to choose our response. And in our response lies growth and freedom. That's the good news. There is a space between now and what's next. And minding that space gives us the opportunity for growth and freedom. So when the prophet Isaiah spoke these words to the people of Israel, they also stood on the threshold between the present moment and what was next. They were in this moment of stimulus, and God was unfolding something before them and inviting them into a certain kind of response. Now, the stimulus was fear. The stimulus was something like hopelessness. Their whole world had fallen apart. They had lost their promised land. This was the lowest point in their history. They had lost their promised land. They had lost their temple. They had lost their royal line. They were down and out, living in a foreign land with no hope for the future. They had all experienced trauma and tragedy and huge amounts of loss, both as a culture and as individuals. That was their stimulus. That was their current reality. That was what they were living in the moment. And did they have a future at all? Did they have a future at all? And God invites them into the space between stimulus and response. We might call it a sacred pause. That's what Brené Brown calls it, a sacred pause into the gap. Let's read Isaiah 43 again. Do not remember the former things or consider the things of old. I am about to do a new thing. I am about to do a new thing. You hear about that. It's coming next. Now it springs forth. Do you not perceive it? Like in this gap in between, there's already clues to what's happening. I will make a way in the wilderness and rivers in the desert. In that space in between, Brené Brown says, there is the power of choice. And here's what Brené Brown said about this in an interview with Rachel Martin just a couple weeks ago. I understand right now that stimulus and response are just smashed together. I mean, that's how I grew up, and I'll add that's how our world is built. It's constant stimuli coming at us. That's how I was raised. Stimulus and response smashed together. It's taken me a long time to be able to run toward the elevator and just get one foot in the door between stimulus and response. But it's the job right now, I think, of great leaders in our families, in our lives, to create a space between stimulus and response. Because we will not have growth, and we will not have liberation, and we will not have freedom. The Buddhists would call it the sacred pause. Maybe in my faith tradition, we'd call it contemplative prayer, but there is no humanity without that space. And the more things are swirling around your head and coming in fast, the deeper your commitment has to be to that space. The world might seem like it's falling apart around us. Do you feel that? There's increasing uncertainty, increasing suffering for people who live on the edges of society, and it seems more and more like the government is oriented around something other than the common good. Our stimulus is not that different than the stimulus of the people of Israel of that time. But the good news is there is a space between what's now and what's next. So in that space, Isaiah says, do not remember the former things or consider the things of old. In that sacred pause, we must let go of what came before. Because what got us here isn't going to get us to what's next. What got us here isn't going to get us to what comes next. It was true for the people of Israel. What got them into exile obviously is not going to be what gets them into what's next. We need to let go of the old stories. We need to let go of our old habits, those autopilot things that we do in response to a stimulus. Do not remember the former things or consider the things of old. We need to, it's not that we can't have memories. It's not that we can't have fondness for the past, but we can't hold on to it with a death grip if we're going to step into what's next with an open heart. Do not remember the former things or consider the things of old. It's an intentional, conscious halt, an actual pause. Brene Brown's team actually jokingly calls her podcast the Pause Cast, because she has developed this habit of pausing between questions and responses, which is kind of awkward, right? Lots of silence is kind of awkward. They call it the pause cast. So this sacred pause might be awkward. It might mean stopping in the middle of a conversation to take a breath, to intentionally open your grip on what came before and to curiosity for what comes next. So the sacred pause, letting go of the way things used to be, and then the response of perceiving the new thing that God is doing. The response of making a choice to act in a way that's in accordance with what God wants to do next, this way in the wilderness and finding these rivers in the desert. Between stimulus and response. So how does this look? How does this look in real life? I was a chaplain in a retirement community when we lived in New Jersey before we came here. And I regularly led worship for people from all of the different levels of care in the retirement community. So what that meant was that there were people with dementia who were in the service, as well as independent living, healthy older adults in the same space. There was a stimulus that came up for me over and over and over again, and it was this one resident who had dementia and hearing loss. And she would yell out regularly during the worship service, "I can't hear you!" That is a kind of a stimulus. She would yell this out regularly, and the staff would immediately, shush her and that was their response to the stimulus, like a stressful stimulus. Somebody's disrupting a religious service, like that's stressful, right? Their response was to shush her. And this happened repeatedly, like over weeks and weeks and weeks, this kept happening. And then they decided they were just gonna not bring her to the worship service, which didn't feel good to me. I really wanted her to be able to be there. So we're all struggling with this stimulus, which was this human being who was doing the best that she could to participate in a way that was meaningful to her. I was able to take a sacred pause. I mean, this was unfolding over weeks, to think about what are my guiding principles here. Beyond the immediate impulse to shush or to, clamp down on the disruption and move on, what are my guiding principles? That every person is a human being who's worthy of love and belonging. That everyone can participate in a way that's meaningful to them. And then I could get curious about what are some options that we have? What are some options that we have? And so we did some experimenting, which was awkward because it led to other, experimenting. We've done that here. We experimented over the summer with different ways of setting up the sanctuary to try to find something that matched what we were after a little bit better. Experimenting can be awkward, but what eventually worked for a little while was for me to pull up two chairs in the front, and I would sit on one, and Mary Beth would sit on the other one right next to me, with her good ear on my side, so that she could hear me and be fully present and participate. And it was just grounding enough for her to be able to sit directly next to me that she could be present, that she could feel like she was loved, and that she could belong without being shushed. Brené Brown tells the story of her work with groups of business leaders. She was working with a company, high-powered company, who was finding themselves falling behind their competitors. And Brené Brown's work is about courage and vulnerability in leadership. And in a particularly tough moment, the CEO of the company, as she had been pushing into and asking tough questions about what courage looks like and what vulnerability looks like, the CEO said to her pointedly, "I don't believe all that stuff about courage and curiosity being good for business. We don't need more weakness, we need more work hours." And Brené Brown, who grew up in Texas and has a kind of attitude, like tough, don't mess with me, her immediate impulse was to fight back. But because she's been doing this work for a long enough time, she was able to, instead of saying, "How dare you?" or something sassy like, "Then why are you paying me tens of thousands of dollars to be here?" She was able to take a breath, to pause, and to get curious, and to say, "It seems like you have a really different experience with what works than what my research says. Where are you seeing the disconnect?" And what unfolded was a powerful conversation unearthing some pain that he carried with him in front of his team in a way that helped them to grow in vulnerability and courage. There is a gap between what's now and what's next. And how we mind that gap makes all the difference. Sometimes the gap is seamless and you can roll your wheels right over it, but sometimes the gap will surprise you. And if you're not paying attention, you'll miss the gap that is there and the height differential, and you'll fall on your face. Now, the train will carry you forward either way. The train will carry you either way into the future. But whether you step onto the train going into the future with your feet underneath you, or whether you fall into the train face first, makes all the difference. What is the stimulus that you need to find the gap in before your response? We have so much so many stimuli coming at us. Maybe it's political comments from people who are close to you that rise up rage in you. Maybe your toddler kicks you. Maybe you see yet again violence in the news. Maybe your closest partner pushes your buttons. There's the stereotypical somebody cuts you off in traffic, which would be glib, except that it happens so often. There is a gap between stimulus and response. And how we enter into God's emerging future matters in the unfolding of the good news. So how will you mind the gap? Will you join me in prayer? God, you are doing a new thing. Help us to trust that. In a world and maybe individual lives too that feel like chaos, you are doing a new thing. You are making a way in the wilderness and streams in the desert. Give us the courage to notice that gap between stimulus and response, where we can make a choice about how to respond, where we can make a choice to live our lives as Jesus would have lived if Jesus were living our life, where we can do something other than fight back, where we can do something other than flee. Give us the courage to mind the gap so that we can be part of this new thing that you are doing in our midst. In your name we pray, amen.